union there. Let's go to our political panel, though. Joining me here in Canberra, Labor MP Patrick Gorman, from Sydney, Liberal MP Jason Falinski. Gentlemen, thanks both for your time. Let's start with you, first of all, Patrick Gorman, because all the mail this morning was that Matt Keogh is going to be elevated, but surely we put you on the map at Newsday. You must be outraged if you're not getting all the way into Cabinet while all this factional stuff's being...
Obviously, that 8-week break that I took really damaged my chances. So, look, we'll find out the outcome once the Labor caucus meets at midday. But we've got a great West Australian team, and no matter how we cut this up, it's been a difficult couple of weeks for the Labor Party. So this is sort of one of very many steps in the rebuild.
Anthony Albanese's made it pretty clear he's flexing his muscle on this, because he said it was a decision by Don Farrell to step aside for Christina Connell, but also that he, that is Albanese, made his view clear on this. Is this fair enough for a new leader to put his imprint on how his leadership team's going to look?
I think that Anthony's style is that he does say what he thinks, and he does have a view on matters that he believes are important. When it comes to the leadership team in the Senate, obviously we want to put our best foot forward. It's going to be a more difficult Senate for Labor to negotiate with, given some of the strong results, frankly, for the Liberal Party. So I think it's entirely appropriate that he makes his views known. And again, I don't want to prejudge my colleague's final decision in an hour or so's time, but I think we'll put forward a very strong team.
Would Christina be a good choice? Would she cut through a bit more than Don Farrell, for example?
I don't think this is a time where we sort of pick between whether one person would cut through and one person wouldn't.
What do you pick it on then if it's not that?
What we're saying is everyone's got a role to play.
Yeah.
Christina has an important role to play. She's given up a lot. She gave up her beloved Sky News to come and join us in Canberra. So I hope that she gets to play a frontline role. And it's going to be a tough 3 years for the Senate team. So we need to put the best foot forward. Don will have a role to play in that. Christina will have a role. And of course, Penny Wong, our leader in the Senate.
Jason Falinski, maybe Newsday's failing to get anyone on the map, because you were left out when everyone headed to Government House as yesterday. And even your good mate Tim Wilson as well talk about whether he'd get elevated on franking credits, maybe the biggest issue that sort of drove the result. What did you make of that?
I think that's really unfair for you to besmirch Tim Wilson by describing him as a mate of mine, Tom. But what I do want to say to you is that I personally, even though Pat won't support her, I think it's important that every party have, as one of its deputy leaders, a former commentator from Sky News. So my question to you is, which party are you picking?
Oh, mate, you know me, very much a centrist, straight down the middle.
So you're joining the Liberal Party? OK, fair enough. OK, got it.
I think the issue is, well, the Liberal Party, if it needs a former Sky commentator on, it will need to... Maybe they'll need to bring back Christopher Pyne, who knows. What about the other decisions made by Scott Morrison yesterday, the eyebrow raiser perhaps? Stuart Robert, he must be on a short leash.
Stuart's a good guy. He understands service delivery. He used to have a business, a very successful business in systems design and implementation. NDIS ultimately is one of the hardest systems implementation programs going on in Australia at the moment, and the most critical one, frankly. So I think having a minister there who has a background in that area is a really good idea. And so, look, I think Stuart will do a great job, and I hope. I hope for the sake of all those people who are relying on the NDIS that we can get on and get that program implemented as quickly as possible.
I think everyone would agree with that. I guess it's the other headlines he's been getting, as one of your colleagues called him, in a non-attributed sense, the self-opening pinata. Patrick Gorman, I do want to move on. You can take that as a comment if you'd like. The headline today on the Folau's law, Israel Folau, of course, getting a lot of headlines during the election campaign. Religious protections as well, coming up as a bit of an issue. What do you make of this push to exempt any ability for someone, a company, to have a contract that essentially impinges your religious views or expressing them?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing we should say that whenever you have the intersection of politics and religion, we should move very carefully, very slowly, and with consultation. I know that the Australian Law Reform Commission is doing some work on these matters, and that report's due next year. So I think we're going to have to work slowly through them. When it comes to, look, I'll confess that when things have a sporting tinge, I'm not much of a sports fan, so these things that sort of happen in the eastern
But
states.
it's still essentially a private contract, if you like.
Private contract.
The MPs pushing this say,
Contract.
this can be separate to what's being considered by the Law Reform Commission. Where do you sit broadly on that principle that a company shouldn't be able to make someone sign a contract and that stops him from quoting the Bible?
Yeah, look, I guess we'll see what proposals the government actually puts forward. We've got a range of backbench government members sort of asserting various things. Some of that's to stir trouble. Some people who are stirring this are people who didn't get what they wanted out of the latest carve-up in Scott Morrison's ministry. I think we need to see what the actual proposals are. I'm really cautious about commenting on how you sort of deal with these intersections of politics and religion when there's not actually a proposal on the table.
Where do you sit on what's been outlined in terms of a principle, Jason Falinski?
Look, absolutely. I mean, we have protections in all sorts of employment contracts at the moment. For example, if you're a union official, you can't be discriminated against on that basis. I agree with Patrick, though. This is something that we need to deal with very cautiously because when there's that intersection, you don't. One person's rights is another person's obligations. So it's how you balance that in law. I guess that's the reason that I often think these things are best sorted out between individuals and organisations without the involvement of governments. But look, this particular incident and situation with Israel Folau has thrown up a whole bunch of really difficult issues for us to work out. And I think it's incumbent on all members of Parliament to come to the debate with open mind on that and find a resolution that works for everyone.
Sounds like both sides are willing to consider what happens there. Another potential interesting and complicated legal issue, Jason Falinski, an Indigenous voice to Parliament. This was basically said from Malcolm Turnbull. He said no to this. He considered it a third chamber. Proponents say, well, hang on, this doesn't actually mean that it's any sort of binding element on Parliament. It's simply another group to represent First Australians. Where do you sit on that?
So I guess my view on this is that it will be a situation that Ken Wyatt has to examine and come to a view on. I suppose my overall view, though, is that we're all Australians and that it's important for all of us to come together on these important issues. I'm not sure that reserving chambers for different groups of people is actually in the best interests of our nation as a whole and in terms of unity, in terms of how our nation deals with issues. So I'm not sceptical.
Doesn't it come back to it, the proponents saying it's not actually a chamber, it's a body, if you like, rather than a chamber, and
so
they're calling this a straw man argument.
So sort of like an advisory body?
Essentially.
Well, we have lots of advisory bodies. Is that what they mean, or? I mean, I think there needs to be
one and one that would be elected as well. So it's giving people, Indigenous Australians, feel they have a bit more carriage, if you like.
Well, we have a lot of elected advisory boards as well around the Commonwealth Government. If that's what we're talking about, then that's something we already have.
Can you name one that involves Indigenous Australians?
I can't name one. Well, all the land councils, for example, are elected bodies that deal with Indigenous issues in those particular areas. Are we talking about a unified or one single sort of land council body? Is that what that would mean?
Look, there is detail to come on that proposal, and even Ken Wyatt has said that. But I guess this could come back to the principle of whether or not Patrick Gorman, there is going to be bipartisanship on this. Whether you're speaking to James Patterson yesterday, he basically said doesn't want something set up that all Australians aren't voting for, if you like.
In that spirit of bipartisanship, can I start by congratulating Ken Wyatt on his appointment? He's a Western Australian. It was quite moving seeing the images of him being sworn in yesterday. I congratulate him and I want him to do well. This is an incredibly difficult challenge that he has. We have seen moments of bipartisanship. We saw the apology was a bipartisan moment for the Parliament, and it was something that took a long time to get to that point. While it was done very early in the term of the Rudd government, it had been discussed for some 10 or so years before it actually happened, probably longer. I believe that we can get to a point where there is a proper Indigenous voice to the Parliament. What shape that takes is not for me to decide, it's for Indigenous people to sort of say, here's what would work for us, because it is so much more than just land. It's more than just commenting on the bills of the day. It's actually about feeling like they are heard in the country that they've been in for some 40,000 years.
See where that gets to in its infancy, but certainly Ken Wyatt saying that for now, yes, detail does need to come, and getting a referenda passed, and we're talking broadly about recognition in the Constitution, never easy, so everyone would hope that there is agreement on that. Just want to touch on a couple more issues before we go. The income tax cuts that the government took to the election. Yeah. I mean, Labor says it didn't have a mandate for much. This is one of the few things. You'd have to really consider just passing this in full and moving on, wouldn't you?
Look, I've always been open that I have concerns about the tax cuts for people on very high incomes. That's a concern that I took to the election, and I was elected, so I will continue to raise that concern. The government does say that they cannot split the bill. I don't know why. They seem to have no technical reason. That just seems to be a very determined push on their part. Labor will continue to discuss this. As I said, we have our caucus meeting in a few minutes' time. We will continue to discuss how we approach these issues. But I agree with you. The government doesn't have a mandate for much. They didn't take much to the election, and it's going to be an interesting 3 years to see what else actually
we might
comes
call that
forward.
selective agreement.
What have we come to where we're verbaling, commentators on Sky News? This is appalling.
It is clearly outrageous. Look, we're going to have to go because we do have Brendan O'Connor beginning. But good to have you back, Jason Falinski and Patrick Gorman, sparring partners again. We'll